اسلاوی، این هفته ما داریم درباره بحران صحبت می‌کنیم در جیوه‌ای. بینندگان ما کنجکاون بدونن که از منظر یک فیلسوف اروپایی مهمترین و بزرگترین بحران‌های جهانی کدوم هستن؟ اگه بخوای به 3 تا بحران اصلی اشاره بکنی، به 3 تا بحران جهانی، چیا رو نام میبری؟
When we talk about crisis today, we should be very specific what crisis do we mean. When I was over a year ago in Seoul, South Korea, people there started to laugh when I talked about crisis. They told me, wait a minute, America, United States are getting out of the crisis. Generally, even African countries are progressing. The Far East, China, Korea, Vietnam, and so on are doing better and better. So they told me, where is the crisis? Except Western Europe. The crisis or Southern Europe. So their idea is that the crisis is not really global crisis, but just the crisis of Southern Western Europe. And they even claim that although we read so much about terrorism, wars, refugees, and so on, this was happening all the time. But if you look at in a broader perspective, this is typical claim of them, humanity was never doing as good as it is doing now. Now, I don't agree with this line of argumentation. I just want to draw attention to a crucial fact that, crisis is never a neutral one. Crisis is always crisis with regard to some expectations. What we today consider a crisis, it was probably 500, 1,000 years ago, or even less, a normal state of things. So again, we should be very specific. But in spite of this, I think, agreeing with your question, that there are 3, even, I would have said, as I developed in my books, 4 domains where we do confront a crisis. The first one is the problem of environment. I think it is clear that if our development goes on the way it does now, we are approaching a certain deadlock. I'm not only talking about global warming, I'm talking about air quality. I heard that you in Tehran, you also have this problem, but it's much worse. Just go to Beijing or Shanghai and take a stroll. They no longer have only that cloth on their face, white cloth, their simple mask. They have real gas masks now. I mean, Beijing today, it's like a landscape from some dystopian Hollywood film where already every day is becoming terrifying. So it's ecology. We don't know what's happening. We don't even have an idea how to counteract it and so on. I claim that the liberal model of global market economy is obviously reaching certain limits. You cannot do it. You cannot go on indefinitely the way we were going on. There will be new and new crises. More and more people are displaced and so on. This brings us to the third crisis, critical point. The crisis, I would say, the crisis of new walls of refugees. I mean, what is happening today globally? Something very sad, I claim, that more and more humanity is falling apart into those who live under cupola, I call it, safe place under an invisible big cover where certain standards are maintained, and those who are out. And the problem of refugees is that those who are out want to come in. And this problem, if anything, is becoming more and more difficult. A new division, worldwide division, is coming, which I think is even worse than the old class divisions about which Marxism was speaking. And then the last problem, which we should not underestimate, it's the problem of biogenetics. Are we aware how quickly things are happening there? I'm trying to follow what goes on there. I claim that if things will be left just to spontaneous development, then soon we will live in a place which will be like some science fiction dystopias. A minority will genetically modify their own children themselves and will control the stupid majority kept out. Like literally, those in power, those who rule us, will become, I claim, not only a different class, but a different biological. This is happening in front of our eyes. I think that maybe this is even the deepest crisis. I'm not exaggerating here, because you know what is happening? Make a simple reflection. What is our basic sense of freedom? It is that reality is out there, but what I think, nobody can touch me here. And even if I may, I hope it will be respectful enough, make a reference to Quran. Even there is a nice passage, you know, I read Quran. It says in Quran, if you are an atheist, that's your free decision. Nobody can force you to believe, only you should behave publicly in a proper way. So you see, it admits this basic human freedom. Do I really believe or not, that's my inner matter. But this presupposes the difference between inside and outside. But this difference today is slowly undermined, not only with psycho drugs, new pharmacomines, and so on, but also with direct connection between our brain and outside. Do you know that at the very elementary level, our brains can be already linked to computers, so that on the one hand, we humans become almost divine. Like, you know, Stephen Hawking, he no longer needs his finger to move his wheelchair. His brains are already connected to the computer, so he thinks forward and his wheelchair moves forward. But you know, it goes also in the other directions. Computers can also already detect, up to a point, it's still very primitive, what goes on in our brain. That is to say, scientific manipulation through chemical drugs, through biogenetic interventions of our brain, confronts us with this big, difficult problem. What is our freedom? And incidentally, even at the level of religion, which for some people is our innermost, most authentic experience, there are problems. Do you know that there is already a new scientific discipline called something like digital brain theology, where they try to locate what happens in your brain when you have a deep mystical or whatever religious experience. And do you know what's the goal? The goal is, I had to laugh, to develop what they call wrongly a transcendental pill. You don't have enough faith, you take a pill, you will start to believe, and so on. I mean, these are mega problems. Things are happening today. So to stop these 4 levels of crisis I see today. I don't know. Oh my God. You mean internet?
خب به نظر مثل متاسفانه اینترنت شما یه مقدار کیفیتش کم شده، ما نمیتونیم خوب شما رو بشنویم. اگر امکان داره اتاقتون رو عوض بکنید یک بار دیگه. و تو این فاصله من میرم سر سوال بعدیم. خب شما به این 4 بحران اشاره کردید. من کنجکاوم بدونم که از منظر شما ریشه های این بحران ها چی هستن؟ بالاخره این بحران ها معلول یک وضعیتن. درباره ریشه ها صحبت بکنید و درباره راه حل ها. آیا این بحران ها راه حلی هم دارند؟
I think this crisis is ultimately, apart from critical points, of course, like Syria and Iraq war and so on, it's basically a crisis of Western Europe. That's the true critical point. Western Europe is losing steam. And I don't think that all people who are opposed to Europe, criticizing Eurocentrism and so on, should be too glad about it. I think that it's an effect of something, this European crisis, of something pretty sad, of how, what was capitalism at its best, this after World War II, social democratic welfare state capitalism, where everybody was guaranteed a certain standard of living, social safety, freedom, and so on, that this model is in deep crisis. Ironically, you know how I refer to this model? I don't know how well known he was in Iran. You remember in the 1990s, it was Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. And it's incredible how, although people mock Fukuyama, but most of us still believe in him. We silently accept that liberal democratic capitalism is the best order that we have. And that the majority of leftists today want to be is, I call them ironically, leftist Fukuyamaists, you know. They accept the frame of liberal democratic state and democracy, but more welfare, more personal freedoms, more democracy, whatever. I wonder if this is enough. I don't think that our ecological predicament will be resolved, or that even we can deal with the danger properly within liberal democratic capitalism. We need large-scale collective acts which will have to be coordinated, regulated, not only at the state level. My God, our very survival is at stake. Imagine just, I spoke with some of my Japanese friends who told me, you remember a couple of years ago, the Fukushima tsunami explosion of the nuclear plant there. They told me, if that explosion would have been a tsunami, just a little bit stronger, they already thought for one day they would have to do it what? The whole Tokyo area, 40, 50 million people, would have to be evacuated. Where? How? And when you have global warming, when you have radical changes in our weather, and so on, air pollution, and so on, market is not strong enough to deal with these problems. That's first crisis, ecological crisis. Second crisis, I think, it's the crisis immanent to capitalism itself. Many observers demonstrated that with latest development in, let's call them digital economy, digital sciences, and so on, the way our lives are regulated through robots, through digital machinery, and so on, something is emerging which no longer can function within market and private property. That's why capitalism has such big problems with so-called intellectual property. And we are, in a way, already there, half in communism. The problem is that this commons, the new shared space, is again privatized. For example, we have cyberspace as a common collective space. And how did Bill Gates become the wealthiest person in the world? He privatized this common space, and we are paying him rent. It's not profit, it's rent. If you look closely at Bill Gates, where does this money come from? The price of Windows program has no relationship to the production costs. He simply estimates how much he can charge and so on. So this phenomena and problem with banks and so on, speculative capital, it's clear that immanently market economy is approaching its end. Globalization paradoxically means new walls, more divisions, more walls for free circulation of people, which is why I claim we will have more and more of problems with refugees, with those who simply have no permanent home, wants to transgress borders, how to deal with all these problems. These four problems, I don't think even the best liberal democratic capitalism can deal with them. And for me, again, this is the problem today. It's the problem of what I call of communism. I don't mean, of course, Soviet Union and those Stalinist communism. What I mean is that these are problems of commons, of some space which should be shared by all of us. Ecology is the problem of our natural environs as our commons, our common space. Intellectual property is the same, our commons, our intellectual inheritance. Biogenetics is our genetic collective inheritance, and so on and so on. This is the problem. And I think the cause of this problem is the same. I'm not blaming capitalism. Let's make it clear. I think that, and Marx knew it, he was all the time emphasizing it, capitalism is the most efficient, dynamic, productive system in the history of humanity. But I claim today it is gradually reaching its limits. And the tragedy is that we don't have a precise idea how to get out of it, how to confront its destructive implications. And so again, I think that I don't blame capitalism. It's not the point that it's guilty, but all the problems we have today are basically the problems of global capitalism. Even what we in the West today scare, what we are afraid most, so-called Islamic terrorism and so on, ISIS, Daesh or whatever. But look at them. In the way ISIS, Islamic State, functions, it's crucial to see how it appears to be in its ideology a radical, even traditionalist, I don't know, Muslim organization. But if you look at its actual organization, it's like a modern mafia. It's totally, not even modern, postmodern dynamic organization, probably dealing with oil, smuggling, drugs, selling ancient sculptures, and so on and so on. So what I'm claiming is that even such an organization like Daesh, like Islamic State, which pretends to totally oppose decadent Western culture, is in its mode of functioning already, in its organization and so on. It's already totally infected by the West. So, and I think, sorry, just to finish that, we had welfare state, social democracy, which as long as it functioned, it wasn't so bad. We had Stalinist communism. Maybe it worked a little bit at the beginning when you had to industrialize quickly a country. But afterwards, when industrialization was done, it no longer worked. And apart from this old nostalgia for local communities where people self-organize themselves, but this model cannot be globalized, this is what always shocks me. Whenever we have a great protest movement in Greece, from Podemos to Syriza to Occupy Wall Street, I was going all around and asking them the same question, demonstrators, protesters there. What do you want? What type of change do you want? I never got a clear answer. I think that the ultimate problem behind all these problems is that we need a radical change, but today's left does not have an answer. What kind of change, how to do it, and so on and so on. And this situation where we all know the change is needed, but we are not oriented into how to do it, these are very dangerous moments. Was it popular among young people in Iran also, that film with Natalie Portman and so on, V for Vendetta? You remember what happens in the end. The crowd penetrates the parliament, people take over, and end of the film. I could just see a film called V for Vendetta Part 2. But what happens then? Okay, the people takes over, we are all enthusiastic. What happens then? What will they do? Will they nationalize economy or what? How will they impose a new order? You know, this is what makes me so suspicious of all these new explosions of the left, from Syriza to Podemos, or even to Arab Spring in Egypt and so on, or even in Turkey. It's all so nice as long as we have the big revolution. Millions of people on the streets, we all cry with them and so on. What interests me is, as they say, to designate in English the alcoholic state, the morning after. But what happens when the big events are over and when life returns to normal? How will ordinary people feel the change?
شما در مطالعات اجتماعی و فرهنگی با مفهوم فانتزی مشهور و معروف شدید. ما در زبان فارسی از کلمه فانتزی استفاده می‌کنیم و غالباً منظورمون توهمه، مثلا میگیم اشکال فانتزی، چیزهایی که خیالی هستن. ولی برای شما فانتزی یه چیز پیچیده تره. اگر بخواید به زبان ساده فانتزی رو توضیح بدید به ما چی میگید؟ فانتزی یعنی چی؟
Fantasy is not something that's crucial. Okay, I don't have time now to go into Lacanian theory, but fantasy is not simply you fantasize as opposed to reality. The most elementary definition in psychoanalysis of fantasy would have been that it's not, let's say, I want something, I fail, I don't get it, so I fantasize about doing it. No, fantasy is that unconscious, usually, structure of my desire, which explains why do I love that woman or that man or whatever. Fantasy provides the coordinates of my desire. Our experience is chaotic. Fantasy is a kind of a, almost, if I may put it in philosophical terms, a transcendental horizon, a texture of meaning, which makes my experience of reality meaningful. That's why, for example, in Europe, the typical structure of fantasy was in 20th century that of anti-Semitism, for example. In Germany in the 20s, for ordinary people, the experience was totally chaotic. You know, inflation, social disorder, instability, and so on and so on. Then Hitler came and said, behind all this is a Jew, the Jewish plot. And everything acquired a certain sense. The situation acquired a meaning. This is fantasy at its most elementary. The way, and why fantasy? Because obviously it's not directly reality, but this is crucial. Fantasy is an illusion. But it's not an illusion about which you dream outside reality. It is illusion which structures your very experience of reality. For example, I will take two opposite examples. If you take a German Nazi, he walks along the street, he sees a Jew. But he doesn't just see that person there, a Jew. What he sees in the Jew is all this wealth of anti-Semitic fantasies. Jew, hidden master, he wants to rape my daughter, and so on. And isn't it the same today, although they function differently? Middle East immigrants from Northern Africa, from Syria, Iraq, in Western Europe. It's clear that we project onto them something that it's not there. But the crucial thing is that it's not, we are not even aware that these are fantasies. This is how we experience them. I see a tired, old, maybe a little bit dirty Syrian immigrant on my street, my fears are awakened, and so on. That's why I published a text in German, which was very problematic for some people. I tried to explain ideological fantasy through the example of, I don't know how popular it is in Iran, Pokemon Go game. You know, what is Pokemon? It's not a digital game so that you stare into the screen outside reality. You look at reality itself, but if you look at it through the screen, you see more. You see Pokemon figures and so on. That's how ideology works. Again, what is crucial is that it is an illusion which structures our experience of social reality itself. We don't experience fantasy, as no, now I'm tired of reality, I will step out. No, fantasy is what I see when I look directly at reality, which is why, incidentally, fantasy is usually the strongest. When people say, now it's the end of the ideology, now I'm a realist, now I just want to see the way things really are. For example, in the Western world, in the 1990s, when it was over with communism and so on, people said, okay, utopias are over, now we live in the real world. But what was this real world? The world of capital and so on, which is precisely purest of all ideologies. So again, the same as for fantasy holds for me for ideology. Ideology for me is not just some abstract theory, dealt with philosophers, sociologists, and so on. Ideology is how we experience our daily life. And here it's difficult to fight racism and prejudices and so on. Because, you know, I don't know how it is in Iran, but a typical citizens of the developed West today, they will say, I don't care about ideology, I'm tolerant, and so on, I respect others. Yes, but when you encounter the real other, all these ideologies explode into your face.
بیایید درباره نسبت بحران و فانتزی صحبت بکنیم. چه شکلی فانتزی بعضی وقتا مردم رو از درک و مواجهه با بحران محروم میکنه؟ به طور خاص شما درباره اروپا خیلی صحبت کردید. چه شکلی در سنت اروپایی، در تجربه اروپایی فانتزی بعضی وقتا باعث شده که بحران‌ها درک نشند؟
Fantasy doesn't prevent us to see the crisis, but it mystifies the crisis. It asks the wrong question. For example, again, back to Germany in 1920s and 30s, there was an economic crisis which was very real. The fantasy of anti-Semitism didn't obscure this crisis, but it provided the wrong interpretive network. It says the Jew is the responsible one. It's the same in the West today. There is in Western Europe a crisis, inertia, instability, and so on. But fantasy enters when you perceive this crisis as the result of some foreigners, immigrants, or whatever, intruding, disturbing our way of life. Fantasy always, if I may use these traditional Marxist terms, obfuscates, masks the immanent antagonism. I think that what we project onto Middle East, Arab, North African immigrants is our own contradiction, our own problem. We in Europe are basically our own problem. We are in crisis. And this crisis was not triggered by too many immigrants or whatever.
خب اجازه بدید بریم سراغ انتخابات آمریکا و نظرات جنجالی شما که بعضی اعتقاد داشتن که شما رسما از آقای ترامپ حمایت کردید. من میخوام به این موضوع بپردازم، اما قبل از اون من یک سوال دیگه دارم. من دقت کردم در نوشته‌های شما گفته بودید که علت پیروزی آقای ترامپ قسمتش به خاطر این بوده که یک ذهنیت لیبرال در آمریکا سر کار بوده که اون ذهنیت لیبرال توانایی درک مسئله طبقه محروم و مستضعف رو نداره. سوال من، چه نگاهی، چه طرز تفکری در این رویکرد لیبرال وجود داره که همواره از درک مسئله و مشکلات طبقه محروم غافله؟ چه اتفاقی داره میفته در این ذهنیت؟ چه فانتزی اینجا سر کاره؟ این شکلی هم میشه سوال رو طرح کرد. چه فانتزی در این طبقه در حال جریانه که نمیتونه مشکلات و مسائل طبقه پایین رو bebine?
The ultimate reason of Hillary Clinton's defeat was that many of those who voted in the primaries for Sanders were so disappointed at how Hillary brutally destroyed Sanders, that they even some of them, some 20% at least, voted for Trump, or they simply abstained. They didn't go to vote. The Democratic Party totally neglected or dismissed as nationalist, proto-fascist, and so on, some real discontent of ordinary people. And it's not just United States, it's also all of Western Europe. We have this surprising success of UKIP in Britain. We have now Marine Le Pen in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, and so on and so on. So that's my vision. This was the educated, liberal middle class. Its basic problems were cultural problems. Tolerance, protection of sexual minorities, and so on, all that. And they were simply blind or even deeply distrustful of the problems of ordinary people. It happened, I think, already with this rise of cultural studies in 1980s. I think that this predominance of cultural studies was the theoretical expression of it. And then in theory, deconstruction, Michel Foucault, and so on. All this obsession with minorities, you know. I think that, and I think again, the reason for this was not that these left liberals are evil or whatever, but that, again, the left till 1970s, 80s, the left did have some kind of global vision, either state socialism or welfare state or whatever. For the last 30, 40 years, again, I don't think the left really has a minimal even vision of future. Even if they are anti-capitalist, their anti-capitalism is mostly moral. It's racist, sexist, and so on. But so it's very fashionable to talk about corruption, corrupted bankers, and so on and so on. But the basic question, what can we replace capitalism with? And how to do it? Who will be the revolutionary agent? And so on and so on. Additional answer, my answer would simply have been that even a very vulgar class approach, this is the mindset of the educated middle class, of the intellectual elite. And which, critical as it may appear, it basically simply fully accepts the global capitalist framework, even if it appears to be a little bit anti-capitalist and so on and so on. I think we don't have even to ask what is in the problem of this mindset is this mindset itself, which is, again, clearly limited to even upper middle class, out of touch, and so on. And as if it, being aware of this limitation, it tries to overcome it through this extreme politically correct moralism, you know, censoring how do you speak, and so on and so on. It's a very tragic situation, I think.
خب با این اوصاف این سوال پیش میاد که چرا شما از آقای ترامپ حمایت کردید؟ البته من از دلایل و انگیزه‌های شما با خبرم، ولی دوست دارم خودتون توضیح بدید چرا اسلاوی ژیژک از ترامپ حمایت میکنه.
Good point. I didn't support Trump in the sense that I think he's in any sense good for America or whatever. I think he will be a catastrophe, although I don't think he's directly a fascist and so on. But I think, okay, I will put it like this. I will use a primitive metaphor. In medicine, we talk about symptomal healing. For example, you have some terrible disease and it hurts. But if doctors can't do anything else, they give you pills that's just to ease the pain. So you heal just the symptom. The illness remains. That's for me the problem with criticizing Trump. Trump is the symptom of the failure of liberal left. The failure of liberal left gave birth to Trump. Its limitation, its blindness for ordinary people, and so on and so on. So my point was simply this one. If we still want to be some kind of leftist, crucial task should not be just to criticize Trump. Of course we should do it. But for example, in the case of United States, to force this liberal left to rethink itself to move more to the left. Not any old communist left, of course, but left in the sense of Bernie Sanders, authentic contact with ordinary people, and so on and so on. So what I hoped, and it's a very risky strategic judgment, maybe I was wrong, but my hope was that if Trump wins, this will be such a shock for the liberal left that it will begin to ask self-critical questions, like what did we do wrong, and so on. How should we change ourselves? Now I'm becoming a pessimist, not that Trump is worse than I thought. I expected nothing else from Trump, but I already see, for example, in American Democratic Party, the first signs of what I call renormalization. Nancy Pelosi, the chief of Democratic Party, of some committee there, already said, nothing horrible happened. We had it with Reagan, with George Bush, the younger, a big right-winger takes over. Okay, we have him for maximum 8 years, then we will come again. It's the same story here. I don't think it's as simple as that. I think that something much more fundamental changed with Trump. In the same sense as in Western Europe, if anti-immigrant populist comes to power, it's no longer the old right wing, the established conservative party. It's something much more radical. So again, my crazy hope, I'm horrified at Trump. Of course, as persons and with their positions, Clinton Democrats are much better. But I think if something doesn't happen in Democratic Party, there will be new and new Trumps. Look at Europe now, Marine Le Pen, UKIP, and so on and so on. This should be a wake-up call for us, leftists, to rethink. And this is, maybe it was a crazy wager. Again, it was not my decision to say maybe it's better that Trump wins. Was not a kind of a principled stance, but a crazy hope that maybe this is one way to reawaken the liberal left.
اجازه بدید درباره داعش هم صحبت بکنیم. بالاخره ما نمیتونیم درباره بحران صحبت بکنیم، درباره بحران در خاورمیانه صحبت بکنیم و درباره داعش حرف نزنیم. بعضی اعتقاد دارن که داعش روی دیگه سکه سرمایه‌داری جهانیه، روی دیگه سکه نیولیبرالیسم جهانیه. آیا شما هم با این تحلیل همراه هستید؟ نظر شما چیه؟ بحران داعش معلول کدوم وضعیته؟
Well, it's relatively simple. If we go specifically to ISIS, isn't it clear that without Syria and Iraq wars, there would have been no ISIS? So first there is this, but this doesn't answer your question, I know. There is this direct military aspect, is the destabilization of Iraq and so on, which opened up the space for ISIS. But more importantly, I think that what ISIS stands for, as I already said, is this. Many people, especially young people, they are terribly disappointed by global capitalism. They don't find their place in it. They feel excluded. But so it's for me more a problem of, and I think religion comes here secondary, although everybody thinks that ISIS is all about Muslim fundamentalism. I think it's not even so much about Islam. It's much more about the disappointment of the young generation. My good friend Alain Badiou wrote a very good text about it, where he developed how in the West, and I think ISIS is up to a point also a Western phenomenon. Did you notice this detail? Very interesting how these terrorist perpetrators of the last bomb attacks in Germany, but especially in France and Belgium, they are not refugees. They are the second generation immigrants there. They're mostly people whose parents were already fully, relatively, at least integrated. So it's a much more complex phenomenon, and it's not only about Islam. Look, I read a wonderful analysis of American-owned fundamentalism. Do you know that, these are official data, FBI, a couple of years ago, they made a report. They have almost 2 million American citizens under observation, I mean, for suspected fundamentalist terrorism, Christian fundamentalist terrorism, 2 million. Among 200 million, that's the same percent, if not higher, than the percentage of terrorists among the Arabs and so on. So again, the question should be not how should we choose between liberal capitalism and terrorism, but why does today's global capitalism open up the space for whatever we call it, fundamentalism, terrorism? Because again, United States are a proof that it's not just Islam or violent, but you know, many of my friends are telling me, but there must be something in Islam, other religions are not so violent. Did you hear about Buddhist terrorism? I immediately tell them, yes, I did. There is in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, there is in Thailand, there is in Bhutan, Nepal, and so on. So again, it's crucial to see the rise of ISIS and similar fundamentalist groups as, of course, it's not directly a product of global capitalism, but those pushed to this edge, this is in a way, the only way they can react. it's a reaction. And as such, it's part of global capitalism. Because at the same time, it's a reaction which economically is fully integrated in global capitalism. My God, take from Daesh, from ISIS, take away from them all the economic activity, smuggling, oil, and so on, whatever, and Daesh disappears in a couple of weeks, I claim. So again, the key question is not, you know, what Western cultural critics like to do, Orientalists, reading some ancient texts where you find how already in Quran you can see the traces of terrorism. Well, if you read it like this, you can find also the traces of terrorism in Bible, in New Testament, and so on. Today's terrorism is an effect of global capitalism.
و اما سوال آخر، من میدونم که شما به ایران و به طور خاص ایران فرهنگی علاقه زیادی دارید. چرا ایران براتون مهمه و چه منظر ایران به عنوان یک تمدن، به عنوان یک فرهنگ تو این مناسبات جهانی برای شما به عنوان یک فیلسوف اروپایی موضوعیت پیدا کرده؟
I would like to do it, and I would like to tell you that I like your country maybe for strange reasons. From when I was a child, from my puberty, I liked that mysterious text of assassins, you know, Alamut and so on. This was the myth of my childhood. I never considered them terrorists. I think they were good guys killing the rich, corrupted ones, and so on and so on. So I have a long affair with Iran, cultural also. I like the movies. I don't like so much, this is the only point I must disappoint you. Who is it? Harun al-Rashid? No, who is your great poet?
حافظ رو میگی؟
Yeah. There I have problems. Very strange. I don't know. I just don't like him. I don't like that type of poetry. But I like old Iranian philosophers. They are now even very fashionable in some circles. You know, I like the whole history of Iran. I also think that in history, by you, I mean Iran, Persian people, were not being given a fair press. You know, it's always this opposition, old Persia, old Iran versus the ancient Greeks. And you have then the bad king emperor against the good democratic Greeks and so on and so on. So in a spontaneous way, I was also on the side of Iran. You know, the European myth is that if Persians were to occupy Greece after all those battles of Marathon, Thermopylae, and so on, that then it would be a catastrophe for Europe. But I'm saying, what if it would not be a catastrophe for Europe? You never know what would have happened. Iran always interested me because it was, because it was neither here nor there. It wasn't ancient Greece, Europe, but it never was simply Orient. But nonetheless, I'm now aware that you are something quite specific there. No, you are really somewhere in between, neither here, neither there. And I think this is, in these stupid times, a very good position to be. And also, I think that originally your Khomeini revolution, I'm not a utopian, but for me, the very fact that it took the circle around Khomeini over almost 2 years to fully take over. Wasn't there, after the Shah fled, a long internal struggle? This struggle itself is for me a proof that it was not simply a religious hardline coup d'etat, Khomeini revolution. Some incredible energy exploded. I mean, it's simply fascinating. And my friends who visited Iran, do you know that the other of the three of my Slovene Lacanian group, me, Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zubancic, do you know that Mladen Dolar was half a year ago for 2-3 weeks in Iran on a private visit with his wife, and he loved it there. He was surprised at how clean and relatively safe it was. He told me that the lesson is, if you are afraid to go to a big city, you should be afraid in New York, not in Tehran, you know. And this is often a nice surprise, a good lesson to us arrogant Europeans, you know. What I just want to tell you is that not to speak about cinema, And by cinema, I don't mean only the big one who just died, Kiarostami, or what. You have others. You know, that's your problem. It's the same as with Sweden in cinema. All my friends there hate Ingmar Bergman. Why? He is great, but one big name like this puts in shadow all others, no? That's the problem with Kiarostami. And I can tell you why I love Kiarostami. Because, you know, when people told me, oh, this is a great director, you should see him, I was afraid that they are giving me this high art movie bullshit, you know, like it's boring, but then you are obliged to praise it. And it was so nice for me to see that, no, it's not boring. These are films which are quite nice to watch.
شما به کشورهای مختلفی سفر کردید. دوست دارید یه روزی بیاید ایران؟
I would love to come to Iran because first, what I know from many of my friends who were there is that there is an incredibly lively intellectual life. It's not this type of general reference to Western philosophy. You have people there who read all the stuff, who know how to debate. So I would find people to seriously talk with and not play this arrogant Western guy who enlightens you primitive people. I would be among equals there. Part two, I'm not fascinated by that hot southern Iran. I would like to see some mountains and Black Sea coast of northern Iran. I don't know why, but that's the mythic area for me. And it's even practical because I think it's not so far. It's just what, 2 hours, 3 by car or what, from Tehran to Black Sea coast, no? You usually go there in the summer to swim, no? So that's all I want. And especially no big historical monuments, or not too many of them. I want to see ordinary life. For me, to really be in a country, I hate to play this politically correct game, tell me about your culture and so on. You really become friendly with the people from a country when you exchange dirty, slightly obscene jokes. That's what I would like to do there. That you tell me, you must have all these jokes about some people from some part of Iran, they are stupid, they are greedy. We have in Slovenia and so on. I would like to have a nice evening with you exchanging dirty jokes.
این رسم جیوگیه که ما از مهمونامون میخوایم که به ما 3 کتاب معرفی کنن. 3 کتاب به ما معرفی میکنید.
Of recent theoretical books, it's not a very complex one. It's simple but very good. My good friend, he is a futurologist, a theorist of catastrophes, Jean-Pierre Dupuy, D-U-P-U-Y. A year ago, he published, he's a greatly respected big figure, he published a small book, less than 200 pages, something like Economy and the Future, about this self-destructive cycle of capitalism and how to deal with catastrophes. The book is full of also wonderful anecdotes, jokes, and very deep. So this guy, D-U-P-U-Y, that's definitely one book I would advise everyone to read. It should be translated and so on. That second book, I don't know how well known are they in Iran, but it may appear strange, but do you know that a Russian writer who wrote in 20s and 30s, Andrei Platonov, Chevengur and so on, he was a Bolshevik, but a Bolshevik who saw the nihilist dimension. And he wrote Foundation Pete and Chevengur, 2 half-utopian, dystopian novels about the nihilism of totalitarian power. But what I like about those movies is that, books, is that they are not written from the usual liberal anti-totalitarianism. But he was a dedicated Bolshevik, but he saw the nihilist dimension. Then a third book, a very short one, maybe it's even translated, I don't know. It's not very good theoretical, but it's a short book that I like to read, and it's even contested theoretically. Susan Buck Morse, American theorist, he wrote a book on Hegel and Haiti, demonstrating how Haiti revolution, the first black democratic revolution, they wanted to be more French than French themselves, was crucial influence on Hegel. And at the same time, I learned there a wonderful thing. You know, she discovered from some memoirs that the key person of Haiti revolution, the one who was awakening, mobilizing slaves, was a guy called John Bookman, like the man of a book. But you know which was this book? Quran. So at least there Islam was clean. Oh my God, the book which triggered the big revolution, Western democratic style, was Quran and so on. That would be three books which I consciously didn't choose Hegel's phenomenology or some difficult stuff, but three light readable books, but they are eternal. To go into serious philosophy, I think it's either my first book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, or one of my last ones, the Absoluter Gegenstoß, Absolute Recoil. That one is my best philosophical book, but it's pretty heavy.
خیلی ممنون اسلاوی که در این گفتگو با من همراه بودی. اگر حرف آخری داری که میخوای بزنی و اگر دوست داری با ملت ایران مستقیم صحبت بکنی خواهش میکنم بفرم.
Thank you, Milad, and thanks also to all the viewers there. I'm with you, and I mean this seriously. Your country fascinates me. I have enough of these stupid screens. I want now, in some foreseeable future, not 30 years from now when I will be dead probably, I would like to be there, and even if I have diabetes, I would like to have a nice Iranian dessert and have a nice conversation. I love your country. Thank you very much.
ما هم امیدواریم